communications with you, but just so you have that information as well. So my name is Kim Good, and I am the chair of the board of Legacy Land Trust Society, and have worked in private land conservation for the majority of my career, I guess. From Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, I've worked directly with landowners to do conservation easements, and I've done research and participated in some policy guidance on private land conservation as well. About 5 years ago, I thought I'd seen it all, and then now there's a whole bunch of new stuff. So I have not seen it all, but hopefully can answer any questions that people have as we go through this. So just right off the bat, we'll get into sort of, I never used to start this presentation this way. We used to just dive right into what a land trust was, but I started finding that there was a little bit of, not confusion, but just lack of awareness that private land conservation happens and how it happens. And so I just want to identify that right off the bat. So basically, private land conservation is the informal and formal things that landowners and land managers do to either maintain land in a close to natural or natural state, or the management activities that they put in place that uses natural systems or processes. So wildlife habitat would be like a conservation aspect, land management, like maintaining that habitat, or perhaps direct seeding would be like mimicking, so trying to not disturb the soil. And the reason that people do private land conservation is for a few things. The personal benefit or goal that they get from that is something that they like and appreciate and want to do. It ensures the reason on a more broad scale, society-wise, is that private land conservation achieves bigger environmental objectives than just parks do. And then other benefits from a personal perspective, I'd already mentioned direct seeding, but offsite watering, like there are economic benefits that can come from working with the natural environment in a way that contributes to private land conservation, meets personal goals, and has an economic benefit. And then how? So land management decisions that get made around beneficial management practices, just on a landowner's property, are sort of the intro informal way. Then they may participate in a municipal program or an NGO program like Alice or Cows and Fish, doing riparian health assessments, those kinds of things, and then just implementing those management activities on their property. Or they may move into a land management agreement. Ducks Unlimited in the past, the federal government has done the permanent cover program, things like that that are longer term, but not forever, or may go all the way to the point of looking at a conservation easement, which you're going to learn lots more about today. So we start next with what is a land trust, because land trusts are the main body that do conservation easements and work with private land conservation projects. Municipal governments and provincial governments and federal, frankly, could all do private land conservation as well as a number of environmental organizations. But since we're a land trust and the main tool we're going to talk about is one that we use, I just thought I'd go into that. So often we hear people say that they want to put their land into a land trust. It's a bit of a language thing, semantics, but a land trust is actually an organization. So we're a nonprofit and we're charitable. And as our core activities, we must have the willingness to accept gifts or acquire gifts of land or interests in land for the purpose of conservation. And that's into our that's our objects as an organization. And in order to be a land trust and to have the charitable status, that has to be what we are all about. And the main thing is that we do this in trust for future generations. So all the conservation easements and land projects that Legacy Land Trust has done to date have been in perpetuity. We do have room to do term conservation easements in the legislation that covers us, but we haven't done that to date. And there's things around that. That's a 201 lesson rather than the 101 that we're in today. So So the main characteristics of a land trust are that we conserve natural, scenic, historical, agricultural, recreational values of land. Um, I have a dog in the room, so if you just heard that, that's her whining, telling me that she would rather be going for a walk right now. We work with private landowners who are interested in working with us. So everything that we do is on a voluntary basis. So the we don't make a landowner enter into an easement or conserve their land. It's all at their interest level. And we use securement tools. So the two main ones we're going to talk about today are easements and land donations, but that's just a little bit of a precursor to that. We're funded privately, so individuals making donations or grants. We apply to foundations, corporations, government, but there's no core funding when it comes to a land trust. We can be, land trusts generally can be small, focused on one property or a couple of properties, or they can be municipally bound, regionally, up to provincial and national in size. Generally, we're non-advocacy. That's not a part of our charitable status. And the work that we do is based on contract. So this comes to the part about the volunteerism of people making those donations versus regulatory. So parks tend to be based on policy or regulation, where we make contractual agreements with landowners to protect their properties, but the tools that we use are based in regulation. So provincially, we have the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, which is the home to conservation easements in Alberta. And then federally, because of our charitable status, we can issue tax receipts. And then we can also participate in something called the Eco-Gift program, which gives landowners a beneficial tax treatment. So I'm going to talk about that more too, but that's just kind of the intro to it. So why a land trust versus giving land to a government or another body? So basically what land trusts offer is an option for private landowners to participate in conservation. Prior to land trusts and conservation easements, all that landowners could really do, it would be to give their land to the government, and then it would become public land. We are a part of a land trust community in Alberta, which is made up of 9 other land trusts. They are, and we say land trust like, and that's the land trust like includes the provincial ones. So there's Crooked Creek Conservancy, which is a small one up in Athabasca. They have really moved more to education versus doing a lot of projects, but they have held land in the past. Edmonton Area Land Trust, which works out of the Edmonton region. And I believe they at one point had set a boundary of 100 miles around the city, but don't quote me on that. And then Legacy Land Trust in central Alberta, where we work Mountain View County and every touching municipality. If there's a reason that makes sense to do a project outside of that region, the board has the ability to make that choice. For instance, we're working on 2 projects in Lacombe County, which is outside of our region, but they're on the north side of the Red Deer River, and we do projects on the south side, so it doesn't really make sense. We could only work on one side of that. Then south of us is Western Sky Land Trust out of Calgary. They do a lot of work along the Bow River, but they also go beyond that. And then Foothills Land Trust, which is the MD of Foothills, and they're a solely volunteer-run group, so kudos to them because it's a lot of work to run a land trust, so that's awesome. And then Southern Alberta Land Trust Society, SALTS, does the Eastern Slopes. Technically, their region is actually all of Southern Alberta, from south of the Red Deer River and the full borders, but their main focus is the Eastern Slopes. And then the Nature Conservancy is a national, as is Ducks Unlimited. And then we have 2 provincial, and these are the more land trust like. Fish and Game Association and ACA are both eligible to hold easements, although it's not their sort of main focus of what they do. And then there's about 150 land trusts across Canada. And there is a national standards and practices through the Canadian Land Trust Alliance, which is now folding into another organization, which isn't that important. But the reason I tell you all of that is just to let you know that we're not a one-off out there on the landscape on our own, that we are a part of something bigger than just us. So we are Legacy Land Trust Society, and Legacy is coming on to about 6 years of age, I believe. And I think we're at 7 projects completed. We have about that many in the pipe being worked on that are funded already, and at least that many beyond that that we don't have funding for yet, but that we're working on. Legacy started as a community initiative in Mountain View County, and there was a staff person at the county that had done some research on it, and then there was a community advisory group put together, and out of that the first board was born. And the main things that really mattered to our community that we wanted to see protected was nature, of course, water, wildlife got listed, agriculture, and history. It was important to the early folks who participated in the advisory efforts to protect and conserve awareness around our rural heritage and what was on this landscape before today. So these are the primary, secondary, and sort of value-added tools that Land Trust can participate in. I'm going to talk mostly about the top 2 here, conservation easements and land donations, but I just want to highlight that there are some others. Land purchases are pretty straightforward. It would just mean that we raised money and actually bought the land. The secondary tools are management agreements or lease agreements. These are often shorter term. And we are looking at a management agreement type situation at Legacy. We're not there yet, so I'm not going to tell you much more about it, but that is something we're contemplating, just as a way to, for a landowner who maybe isn't sure that they want to do something permanent at this point in time, but they do want to participate in conservation or stewardship activities. Lease agreements are somewhat similar. We would lease the land for conservation purposes. Education and extension, we do a lot of. For those of you who are already members of Legacy Land Trust's Circle of Friends, you would be receiving a newsletter once a month, as well as any sort of general information about events that we plan or participate in. Land swaps are where maybe land is privately or publicly held that has conservation values that are not being managed for at that point in time. So this has happened with the province, with other conservation organizations in the past, where they trade, or even with private landowners actually, where they trade a less than conservation value property for one that has conservation value. And then value-added tools, transfer of development credits, grass banks, offsets, and mitigation. And the reason we have the check mark on offsets and mitigation there is just that this is something that has been worked on in the province through the Alberta Land Stewardship Act for quite some time, and it's something that we're quite interested in. So it would be where there was some kind of development in one place and some kind of offset or mitigation for conservation on the other. So we'd be willing to be an agent in that regard. So conservation easements of their own, I'm just going to go through a few slides on what these are. So a conservation easement is essentially a contract between a landowner and a qualified organization, which all the land trusts in the province are. The easement itself gets registered on the land title, and so it runs with the land regardless of the owner. So it is a permanent, unless it's been set up as a term, but as I said earlier, all the easements that Legacy has done to date have all been permanent. And even if it were a term, like even if it were a 50-year term and the landowner changed, the second landowner would still be bound by the content of that conservation easement on their property. I also mentioned that the landowner voluntarily grants those rights to the land trust. It's not, nobody's making them do anything. It's a voluntary action. And the interesting thing about conservation easements versus other easements is that we can have both negative, so things that you can't do on the property, and positive, things that you can do on the property into the agreement. When most people think of easements, they think of right-of-way easements or utility easements or something like that. And those are always negative in nature. So I have heard a few lawyers say that they think that the name conservation easement is a little bit unfortunate. And there are other provinces actually where they've called them conservation covenants instead, so more of a conservation promise versus an easement, but that's what we have in our legislation, so that's what it is. So when we think about land ownership, just to sort of understand how conservation easements work, is we think of land ownership as a bundle of rights. So we have the right to cultivate, to irrigate, to build a house, to subdivide, to harvest trees, to graze it. And the reason we have below this opportunities is because we are bound by municipal rules. So we can't just subdivide because we feel like it, or build because we feel like it. We need to get permits and get permission from our municipal government. But those are all the things that you really have, there's nothing telling you you can't do that. And so when we consider this cute little farm here that has all these abilities or opportunities and a qualified organization, basically the landowner takes some of those rights or opportunities and grants them to a qualified organization who will then retire them. So they're not eligible to be used anymore. So it's not like in giving the ability to build or subdivide away that now the land trust can do that instead. They've retired those rights through the conservation easement. So often the next question that comes up from people is, how does a conservation easement get valued? If I'm giving something away about my property, or I'm making a future landowner do something like graze in a certain way or cut trees in a certain way, or they're only allowed to put a house in this corner, like you're putting sort of rules on them, what does that do to the value? And so if we consider that this whole rectangle altogether is the fair market value of the property before the conservation easement, and then we put the conservation easement on, or we imagine, and we use certified appraisers to do this, that by putting these restrictions in place or these requirements in place on a future landowner, they're not going to be willing to pay as much. And so the residual value is what they would be willing to pay after the easement were in place. And the difference between that is the value of the conservation easement. It should be recognized that this is a snapshot in time. When we get an appraisal done for a conservation easement, we're only able to use it for 6 months if we're going to actually do the project with a landowner, because it could change over time. Everybody knows that based on all kinds of circumstances, real estate values can fluctuate. And that would be the same with the CE value, because your before price might change or your after price might change based on other circumstances. And so now we know that value, what do we do with it? And so the next question is, how are landowners compensated for entering into a conservation easement? So number one, I always say your personal conservation goals are achieved. No one, I'm afraid, will ever get like super rich off of entering into conservation easements. But we hope that we can offer some level of compensation to a landowner for doing it. So then it comes into sort of the financial side of things. And so how people are compensated depends on how the CE is transferred from to the land trust. And so it could be 100% donation, in which case it would be, actually, that's on the next slide. So the way it will get transferred is either 100% donation or partial donation sale. And I use sale loosely, but what this is called is a split receipt. And I'll explain that in a sec. Or a full sale. Very few land trusts buy conservation easements outright, and even fewer can buy them for the actual value of the easement. So I'll speak to that in a moment. And that's just because of the funding models that we have. It's hard to raise funds to buy an easement. 1, 2, it's harder to raise funds to steward the easement longer term. So we tend to do most of this through donation. And then the fourth way might be in participation with a municipality. There hasn't been a lot of examples of this in Alberta, but there certainly have been in other jurisdictions where conservation easements are well known. So in the case of a full donation, the landowner would receive a tax receipt for that value. So that full value of the conservation easement, straight donation, they would receive a tax receipt. They also have the ability to participate in what's called the eco-gift program. So this is a federal program. And what happens is between Environment Canada and CRA, there's a process built where the appraisal gets put through a review panel. Environment Canada certifies that the land is ecologically sensitive. The appraisal goes through the review panel, and then assuming that all goes as it should, then the landowner has the ability to use that tax receipt for up to 10 years instead of 5 years. They can use 100% of the tax receipt instead of 75 in any given year. And they can, there will be no capital gains assessed. Anytime there is what's called a deemed disposition on a land title, it will trigger capital gains. So even though it's a donation, once you donate part of that interest, it would trigger a capital gain. And so if it goes through the eco-gift program, that capital gain is not, it is not recognized. You can do it where it doesn't go through eco-gift, so that would be called a capital gift, and it may trigger capital gain. Generally, the conservation easement tax receipt will cover the capital gain, and then hopefully it can also be beneficial to the landowner. So one of the challenges right now with protecting conservation or protecting agricultural land is that there's not an ag gift program. So unless there's significant ecological value that comes with the agricultural part, it may end up having to be a capital gift versus an eco gift. But there's still tax benefit there. It's just not as good. The second way that that partial donation sale can be a split receipt. So the rule is that if somebody's making a donation that they're going to receive some cash for, they can't receive that value of the conservation easement in cash more than 80%. That's okay in land conservation because we can never afford 80% of conservation easement value. More likely, we're in the 20% range. And then, so if the full CE value was $100,000, say, for easy math, we might pay $20,000 in cash and a tax receipt of $80,000. That is still eligible to go through the eco-gift program if it is certified as ecologically sensitive. So you still would get no capital gains, still be able to use the tax receipt for up to 10 years and against 100% of your income. Now, this is all going to be gone over when we have our accounting webinar, but this is just the intro to that to sort of fit that into the stage. Then a sale. So a land trust could buy a conservation easement. Generally, it will be some percentage of the conservation easement value. There were a series of purchases done around Cypress Hills, and they did them on 20% of the full fair market value. Actually, the conservation easement value was greater than that, but that's how they just established that it was based on a specific funder who was willing to pay for that those conservation projects. And then you might get a development relaxation, as mentioned before. So an example of this was in the MD of Foothills, there was somebody who wanted to do a development project on their land that was slightly over and above what would have been allowed through the land use bylaw. And so the county said, well, we'll consider it if you would then protect the rest of the property with a conservation easement. This didn't end up happening only because when they went to public hearing, the neighbors were not in favor of what was happening. So the county did not allow that project, but that is a way that conservation easements can be used in municipalities. So then the next main tool I just wanted to talk about today is a land donation. So somebody might decide that they don't want to do a partial donation through a conservation easement. They want to do a whole donation. And so they would like to do the entire property. Again, this is voluntary, it's contractual, it's a real estate transaction for all intents and purposes, except when it says the value of the land, it's zero instead of having a purchase price. The title would transfer to Legacy Land Trust or whichever land trust a person's working with, and they would receive a tax receipt for the entire value of the property. This can be done in life, or it can be done after death in an estate. Regardless, it's always important that a landowner who's interested in doing this talk to the conservation or the land trust, the conservation group or the land trust in advance, so that the land trust understands the wishes and what the landowner is looking for and can live up to them. One thing to note is this can also go through eco-gift program. So a land donation could be given through eco-gift and it would get the same beneficial tax treatment as the easements that I just spoke about. So there are circumstances where landowners have entered into an easement in life and then have chosen to give the rest of the property to the land trust either later in life or through their estate. Yes, so have the conversation with the land trust, outline the long-term vision of what the landowner would like to see with that property, and then the land trust has the opportunity to determine that they can do that or not. I have seen circumstances where a landowner chose to donate land in life through the, not through, I don't remember if they did an eco gift or not, but they could donate the land, receive the tax benefit from that, and then allow the land trust to put a conservation easement on it and sell it so that the conservation values and objectives are still met. And they just received a greater tax receipt, basically. I've also seen where people have donated it that doesn't have ecological value, and they can sell the land so that it's like $1 donation instead. And for whatever reason, in that landowner's personal circumstances, the landowner donation made more sense than a cash donation. Once it is owned by the land trust, they treat it very much like an easement, and I'm going to go into that in a sec, but a baseline documentation report is done so we understand the biophysical circumstances of the property, any management concerns that we need to put in place, either grazing plans or some water management, fencing, weed control, trail maintenance, anything along those lines, so that we can do that long term. There are situations where land trusts have own property and they may lease it for different purposes. Mostly it would be agricultural. And then others where instead of leasing, maybe it's open to the public. Edmonton area land trust has a number of these where they have trail systems. They're really great to access and they're fantastic community assets as well. And then after the conservation easement or the donation is made, then our job really starts at that point in time. It's a lot of effort to get to the point where the land trust has interest in the property or owns it, but then we have it forever. And so stewardship is our job at this point in time. And so that requires baselines, that requires annual monitoring, that requires paying the taxes if we own the property, that requires managing access to the property, doing invasive species management, any sort of fencing that needs to come down because maybe it's not allowing wildlife through, or fencing that needs to go up because there's damage happening to a creek or whatever. So this is really the long-term job of land trusts. And that's actually the end of my presentation. So it's half an hour, not 45 minutes. You might get a better chance to eat lunch. But I just wanted to put some contact information up here. Mary Jane, who's going to facilitate, if there's some questions, she'll facilitate that for us. She's our conservation director, and Carrie, who is our executive director. Phone number there and emails, and you're welcome to reach out to me as well, but they are better at getting back to people.
All right. So
if time's not of an issue, people can speak up if they don't want to type.
Okay.
If that's okay with you, Kim.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if there's anybody who wants to come off mute and comment or talk or ask questions of Kim, that would be perfectly fine.
Oh, I have one question in the chat. Kim, could you explain some of the types of conservation easements that we currently have?
Yeah, sure. So our first conservation easement is a ecological / agricultural. It's a wooded parcel that has some really impressive waterways across it. When we first did the conservation easement, there was a massive beaver dam, which as nature would have it, has come out. And so that actually requires that we are going to have to participate in some invasive species management on that property with the beaver dam releasing. On it is some light grazing annually. The easement itself maintained the right to put a building site at some point in time. It's restricted to an area that had already been disturbed by oil and gas, and that's a quarter section. There's that one. We have two properties that County of Mountain View did conservation easements with us on, and they both have cattle grazing lease agreements on them. We have another one that a landowner has hosted a number of buttercup blitzes on. So I don't know if anybody on the call is interested in coming out this summer and pulling some buttercup with us, but that's an annual effort to reduce the buttercup on the property. And then we have two other ones that are along the Little Red Deer River that both have some aspect of agriculture, but predominantly the river systems and the forests on the property provide the massive ecological benefit to those properties. So I'm not sure if anybody has further questions on.
I've got a question, Kim.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Hey, Fred, nice to see you.
Yeah. Well, what's Legacy's policy on carbon credits coming down the line here on
Yeah,
the ownership and stuff like that?
Yeah, good question. So in preparation for hope that ecological goods and services programming was coming, of which carbon credits is one of them, we have a clause in our easements that leaves that benefit to the landowner. So as long as the carbon credit program does not state that a current easement cannot participate, which is a risk, but if they can, then that's up to the landowner and they can apply and participate as they wish. Does that answer your question?
Sort of, because
Okay.
it's getting to be a big concern right now with our clients,
Okay.
as to the ownership and what you have to do to qualify to get those credits, because you can lose them too.
Yeah, so the risk is if somebody's had a long-term conservation easement, if the program or the, like right now in most, like if it's an avoided conversion, so somebody who's got native prairie or permanent cover that they've already agreed to maintain, the challenge, the global desire for most of the time for these programs is that it be additive carbon that's being stored. And so if it's had an easement on it for 10 or 15 years, those programs will automatically assume that there was no risk of that being let go. So they won't consider it additional. We have tried to alleviate that by our lawyer had drafted, I thought it was a good clause saying that if any of these programs come to be, we don't own the carbon, like that's not a part of our interest. Therefore, we think it should be allowed. But a lot will depend on program design.
Yeah, I don't think that's fair to the ranching community.
I agree with you. I've participated as an advisor and on a number of these talks, and I wholeheartedly agree. The landowner was compensated for the real estate value of the property, not the ecological goods and services. So I agree with you.
All right. If there's any changes, let me know, because it's a big part of our practice right now.
Yeah, for sure. And if you'd like offline, maybe send me a quick email. It's just Kim at Legacy Land Trust Society, and we can talk about that further.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, I have another question, Kim.
Okay.
Where does a landowner start if they're thinking of an easement?
So the starting point is coming to this workshop. So good job. Then there are a few resources. One is, I think it's Alberta-CE or CE-Alberta.ca. It's a website that the Environmental Law Center and the Mistakis Institute put together, which is Conservation Easements 101 or 201 and kind of every level. It's all based on questions. So that's a great start. The other is to interview the land trust. So anyone that your property fits within their geographic boundary, call them and ask questions. And the next part after sort of deciding that it is what you want to do is to communicate your vision for your property with the land trust so that they can make sure it fits with their objectives and start drafting the legal documents. So I often say that the reason to get into conservation easements is often the art. And then we've got to put it into the black and white legal side of it, which is kind of boring, but that's the necessary part. And we also do recommend that early on you speak with your financial advisor and your lawyer. One of the challenges is that your land is often a major asset for people, particularly on working landscapes like the prairies. And there are a number of lawyers and financial professionals who maybe haven't been involved with easements in the past before or know about them. And so sometimes you'll get kind of a, why would you consider doing this? So just push it a little bit and let them know that it's not all about money all the time. And then whichever land trust you meet with, they'll have a process that they share. Does that answer? I hope.
Great. And Carrie did pop that email address into the chat box. So if anyone is looking for that conservation easement site, it's in the chat box there. You can grab it from there.
So ce-alberta.ca. Thanks, Carrie.
Okay, another question. How long does it take to get a conservation easement?
Oh, great question. It will definitely take a year at the if you are like super fast and you know exactly what you want and everything's really lined up, it will take a year. It can take up to 3 years. I would say on average, they're usually about 2.5, 2 to 2.5 years. But and the only time it kind of goes to the 3 years is if there's sort of weird things that come up or but yeah, it was actually, I'll never forget, we did a presentation, myself and a colleague years ago down in the Crow's Nest Pass, and a fellow came up and said, okay, tell me where to sign. Like he was done. This is happening. It was just gonna happen. We're like, no, we have to talk to your family and you need to talk to your lawyer. And so a year is a quick easement. And that's actually once we have funding in place. So it can usually take us applications. Most of our programs are funded through the Alberta Land Trust Grant Program. We are starting to broaden that out because some of our properties that have more agriculture and being in Mountain View County in central Alberta, we tend to have more mixed landscapes than a lot of the further south or the further north do. And so we're going to need to branch out on our funding over the next number of years as we get more and more of those properties. So, but Land Trust Grant, the applications go in September. We usually hear by end of February, start of March if it's successful, and then it will be a year after that at the fastest.
Okay, another question. Does stewarding mean that legacy comes onto my land, and what are they looking for?
Okay, so for every single conservation easement, part of our completing that is doing something called the baseline documentation report. And so that is the state of the land that we all agree, the landowner and the land trust all agree is the either the goal or the what we expect to see there over time, recognizing that there are, hailstorms and little tornadoes and there's natural things that happen on a landscape, or an aging forest, trees will start to fall down, and so then there's an annual visit. So yes, legacy will come onto the property each year. We come once for sure, unless we're invited at other times or if there's a problem. The first generation landowner, there's generally no problems with. But what we do is we take the baseline and the conservation easement, and we have a monitoring form, and the steward, the monitor comes out, they retake the photos from the baseline, they write a comment on each of the restrictions. If everything's fine, it's just a check mark. If there's any concerns, it's identified. And then the landowner, in some time before the next monitoring visit, will receive a phone call and hopefully a visit if it's not COVID restrictions in place. And the landowner will always have a copy of both the baseline and the monitoring report from each year. Stewardship also means that if the landowner has a problem or a question, like I've got like our buttercup tall buttercup problem, the landowner has come back to Legacy and said, can you help us manage this? So we put together a volunteer team. So that's also a part of the stewardship and coming onto the land.
Okay. Does the ongoing stewardship of my conservation easement cost me?
No, it does not cost you. So part of our fundraising on the front end is to create an endowment for each property. And so we've been really lucky through the Alberta Land Trust Grant Program that it is a fund that recognizes that we have a responsibility forever with this property. And so we're able to apply for a chunk of money that we put into a fund that allows us to be able to come out every year to see the property. How Legacy has been funding it to date is a combination of that and through the Canada Summer Jobs program. So in first generation landowners, it's pretty straightforward for the most part. And so we've been using summer students that we train to come out onto the property, take the photos, do the checklist. And then if there's anything of major concern, then it would be more of a staff person or a board person that would talk to the landowner. But it does not cost the landowner for stewardship over time. If there are stewardship management activities that need to happen, like in the case, actually, like if in the case of the beaver dam going out, the landowner, if a recommendation was to fence that area to reduce cattle impact on it, which it wasn't, but if it were, then the landowner would do the fencing, but Legacy would try and help. So we would either try and find some funds or introduce the landowner to some funding opportunities, or maybe have volunteers come out and pound posts and staple wires if it's just a small area, because fence building is not always a volunteer type thing, but if it were a smaller area, it could be done that way.
Here's a good one with regards to having people on your land. Does the public have access to my conservation easement?
So no, in every conservation easement, the access is maintained by, access management is maintained by the landowner. So if you previously allowed people to access your property to see the view, in fact, we met with some landowners the other day, and they have a group come out each year to look at plants and to see, just to access the property. That continues, that's up to them. So a conservation easement does not, it gives us no ability, and nor do we want it to require or grant access to your property. So the private landowner continues to manage access to the property.
Super. What happens to the conservation easement if Legacy Land Trust doesn't continue to operate?
So we have in our bylaw, so there's two places this is stated. One is we have in our bylaws that if we were to fold or to not exist as an organization, that all of our easements would pass on to, and their stewardship endowments would pass on to a like organization. As well as the conservation easement legislation within ELSA states the same thing. So it's protected both by the legislation that allows us to do it, and through that, it is even in the conservation easement documents that say if Legacy is not to exist, then it will be passed on to a like organization, and we have it within our own bylaws. We have had landowners in the past ask if they could name the organization. I don't have a problem with that. Like it's possible. So you could have in the conservation easement where it says if Legacy doesn't exist anymore, that we would pass it on to organization X.
Anybody else have any questions? If you can either put them in the chat box or unmute and speak up. Those are some really great ones so far. Pretty quiet.
Quiet.
All right.
Well, if everybody's got their questions answered, we'll let
I
Kim think
can ask one for you guys. Can you have,
Okay.
and you might have answered, I'm sorry, I showed up a little bit late, but is there overlapping easements from different entities? Can there be?
That's a good question. So as far as I'm aware, Nobody has done that in Canada. I actually was just doing some research a few weeks ago, and I got a whole bunch of papers, but I haven't had a chance to read them yet, from the States, and one that's an opinion piece. So theoretically, yes, and I can't see anything in our legislation that says you can't. So if you did an easement today that just said you wouldn't subdivide, but maintain the right to build, and then you did a easement 10 years from now that took away the right to build, how, in my mind, that would happen one after the other on the title, like the logistics of making that happen, but there should be no reason that it can't happen. But it hasn't really been tested yet that I'm aware of.
What about for funding? Like if you guys had, say, I was from Ducks, which I am, and you had a property that Ducks could come on and restore a wetland, they put a 10-year easement, would you guys be eligible for that? Like, could we treat you as a landowner, or would it be a different deal?
So so is that where we already own the property, or?
Yeah, where it's within your possession.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So if we owned property that didn't have an easement on it and another organization wanted to put an easement on it, for sure. Yeah, there's no issues with that.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, I thought you were referring to if there wasn't, like if it was privately held and say Ducks had an easement on the wetland area, and then the landowner said, well, we want to do another easement on the upland. Could you layer them that way? I think you can too.
Yeah, both questions are actually really relevant somehow.
Yeah. I mean, and I have talked to a number of lawyers about this. So as I get through these papers, I'll send you a note and see what, if anything's really off on that, I'll let you know. But they do it in the US all the time, and that's a lot of what our legislation is built on. So
excellent, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. They're all good questions, but that one's fun. I don't get it very often.
I have one more. What actually is a baseline?
Okay, so a baseline is a biophysical report. So we have a consultant go out on the property. Generally, they're a biologist, an agrologist, a forester, depending on the property, and they document all the natural features on the property as well as all the anthropogenic features. So anthropogenic are like fencing and buildings, corrals, houses, barns, anything that people have done to the property. And then they also document wherever there might be some risks to the overall integrity of the property. And then that helps us identify where we need to monitor or if we need to work on a management plan about a specific topic. So weeds, for instance, they're the most common one. The biologists might find sort of in the back corner, there's a big patch of wild caraway or something that we want to deal with. So they would identify that and let us know that that's something we need to do, to check on. And so it's basically a snapshot of the moment in time that the conservation easement is registered and what our expectation is of the conservation values going forward. As conservation easements get older, when we're 50 years into this, so neither Carrie, Mary Jane, or myself will be the person dealing with this, but based on the years of monitoring, 50 years of monitoring, at some point in there, you might need to redo parts of a baseline. There's a property up by Drayton Valley that I worked on a conservation easement with years and years ago that had a tornado touchdown. So you're definitely going to want to make sure that gets documented. I'm not sure that's enough to make a baseline or even a partial baseline be redone, but a flood might. Like you might want to go in and do more than just monitoring that to show that something natural has had a fairly significant impact.
Great, those are some great questions. I think maybe we'll wrap up questions there, and because Carrie has a couple of minutes of housekeeping before we wrap up and let you go at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, we just wanted to thank our partners and a little bit of an intro to what's coming up in the next 3 Wednesdays. And my other question is for you to think on is we are going to have an interview or discussion with a landowner in the last Wednesday. And if you have any questions about sort of their experiences or anything that, you you think they might be able to answer. If you want to share that with me through email, that would be great, because then we can help them prepare answers in advance. Doesn't mean you can't ask questions at the time. It just if there is something that comes to mind that you'd like to talk to someone who's gone through the process, feel free to send me a question. And we're not going to do an evaluation until the very end, so I won't be sending you anything, question wise. And I think, honestly, I think that's all. Is there anything else the other two would like to add?
I would just like to say thanks to everybody for coming out, and nice to see some familiar names, if not faces, because of non-video. And just want to highlight Dart Bryant and MHR have been longtime supporters of Legacy, and we really appreciate all the work that they've provided to us. And we have a new law firm, Elevator Law, that is also quite supportive of conservation and conservation easements, who you're going to hear from Dan McPherson as we go. But I just really want to thank those professionals, because without them, some of the complicated parts of our business couldn't happen. So, and thanks to Carrie and Mary Jane for putting this all together.
And thanks, Kim, for informing us all.
Happy.
Okay. So if there's no questions, we'll be here for another 5 minutes, but feel free to go back to your lunch and the rest of your day. Enjoy the sun.
Thank
So,
you guys very much. Thank you. It was really good.
thanks, Jill.
Thanks, Roger.
You're welcome, Kim. Thanks very much for the presentation.
Yeah, nice to see your name.
Yeah, and I'll have to touch base with you, given my new job with Environment Canada as a SARPAL coordinator. So,
Oh, wonderful.
yeah, if starting in January. So look forward to speaking with you. Yeah, got to run, but we'll be in touch.
Thanks so much.
There was one question about the recording. So yes, it is recorded, and the questions were recorded as well. So once we get off of here, we'll have a look through it, make sure that it worked, and then we'll send that recording out to you, to everybody that was registered. Yeah. So if people have partners they want to share it with, or other people that registered that didn't get to see it yet, everyone will get a link to the recording. Yes, I will post it on YouTube. Actually, that's a good question. I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure how we share the recording. I think it does have to go on YouTube.
Yeah, we do it. We have a YouTube channel. Legacy Land Trust has a YouTube channel, and then some of the things in there are private, so you can only see it if you have the actual link. But I think eventually we're putting it on the website. Is that the plan, Carrie?
Yeah, we're waiting to launch a new website, so just contact us directly if you do have someone specifically that you want to share it with within the next 3 weeks, because I was thinking of putting it out until they were all done and put it out as a series. But if you want somebody to catch up, I know there's a couple of people who couldn't attend today. Just let us know and we'll see if we can get it to you beforehand.
Cool.
Another question. Are there any land trusts in Saskatchewan?
There are. So the Nature Conservancy, of course, and Ducks Unlimited work in Saskatchewan. And then there was one called Genesis. There's other organizations in Saskatchewan that can hold easements. Like the Saskatchewan, Tom Harrison just went off. Who asked the question, Mary Jane?
Sally.
Sally, okay. Yeah, Tom Harrison, who was just on the call, he would be able to answer that better than me, but in the olden days, they were called SWIC, and then they became the Saskatchewan Water Authority. The Saskatchewan Wildlife, what are they called? I think maybe Saskatchewan Wildlife Corporation or Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation, they can hold easements, and they hold quite a lot, actually. And then there was one called the Genesis Land Conservancy, and they changed their name a few years ago, which I don't remember the name anymore, but they did farmland. They didn't do a lot of easements, but they set up like farming mentor partnerships and things like that. And then the big guys, NCC and DU, are kind of the most active in Saskatchewan, other than this wildlife group whose name is gone, but so they do exist. Manitoba is another one that's interesting. So BC has a lot, Ontario has a lot, Quebec has a pretty good number. The Maritimes are decent enough number. Newfoundland doesn't have any, I don't think. I think only NCC works there. Alberta has the most of the prairies, Saskatchewan, and then Manitoba, it's NCC, Ducks Unlimited, Delta Waterfowl also will work there, and Manitoba Heritage Corporation. And that's it. Like Saskatchewan and Manitoba have the lowest number for sure, which is kind of crazy because they got massive settled land.
All right.
Well, I think it's 1 o'clock, so, or 12:58. Thank you, everybody else is still around, and I think we'll leave it there. And if you have questions, just email me.
Awesome.
So
thank you so
have
much.
a lovely day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.
I don't know how to leave the meeting.
It's Mary
Oh, I
Jane, I'll
know.
cut us all off.
Okay, I gotta close my presentation, then I can.